Welcome to this evening's lecture with Professor Lance Straight. Lance is a professor of communication at Fordham University, where he has served as chair of the Department of Communication and Media Studies and director of the MA program in Public Communication. He's internationally recognized for his intellectual leadership in the discipline of communication, with over 12 books written or edited and over 100 scholarly article publications. Professor Straight's scholarship has focused on the development of media ecology as a field of inquiry, with special attention to the work of Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, and Neil Postman. Lance has written on a broad array of other topics as well, including the historical relationship between modes of communication and socio-cultural phenomena such as heroes, religion, nationalism, the city, the self, and consciousness. He's written on the impact of new technologies and digital media, including online communications and mobile telephony, on media history and futurism, on language and symbolic communication as it relates to media and technology, and on communication and autism, and on popular cultural phenomenon, including television, film, baseball, masculinity, science fiction, and the sense of smell and alcohol. Lance has founded the media...
Those are two separate things, by the way.
Not necessarily. Lance also founded the Media Ecology Association, for which St. Mary's College is proud to host the 18th annual convention of the MEA this coming June. Yeah. Many will consider the founding father of media ecology as Marshall McLuhan, and one of McLuhan's most famous aphorisms was, "The medium is the message." The title of tonight's presentation is "What We Mean by Medium and Why Is It the Message?" Why it is the message. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Professor Lance Straight.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you to Ed Tywoniak, and it's such a pleasure to be back at St. Mary's College and enjoying the beautiful weather and, of course, the excellent company. I'm happy to be able to share with you some thoughts and that I've been working on. I mean, it feels like all my life, but certainly for quite a few years, and that this talk is actually it kind of preceded in some ways, and it also comes out of a book that I have coming up whenever the publisher is damn ready to get it out. Hopefully, maybe it'll be out in time for MEA. If not, it'll certainly be out for the fall. And the title is Media Ecology, an Approach to Understanding the Human Condition, being put out by Peter Lang. So part of the book will be a chapter on what we mean by medium. But let me start, first of all, with Neil Postman, my old professor, who defined media ecology as the study of media as environments. And that definition implies that media can be defined as environments. And we want to think about, and this is also true in general semantics, where we really want to think about how we use language and how we define our terms, and understand that words are human inventions. I mean, there's no essence of medium or media out there. It's a question of using the word as a tool and how we choose to define it in ways that hopefully are useful. They're conveniences, maps that we create of territories that may be familiar or may yet be undiscovered. So I want to take up the key term in media ecology, which is this word medium, and discuss its meaning. And in doing that, I want to suggest that the way that media ecologists use the term might be styled as medium writ large, that is a much broader and more inclusive understanding, and one that's different from the way the term is used in just about any other field. So let me begin, and before I go into this, I really want to, I feel absolutely obligated to state unequivocally that media is a plural noun. Now, I do recognize that many today treat media as if it were a singular noun, but when it comes to a phrase like media is, well, Shakespeare's words come to mind. It will be proved to thy face that thou hast men about thee that usually talk about a noun and a verb, and such abominable words as no ear can endure to hear. But I want to make it clear that the problem is not simply a matter of good grammar. And I have no objections, for example, to splitting infinitives. Indeed, I'm quite ready to boldly split a few myself. But I do think my concern is not just a matter of splitting hairs. If you turn media into a singular noun, in effect what you're saying is that the differences between different types of media don't matter. That all that matters is what they have in common, and the differences are not significant. Now, the fact that we have such a term as media does suggest that it is a category, a single category that many different types of phenomena can be placed into. And so these different kinds of things have certain things in common, certain characteristics in common. But only paying attention to what all media have in common leaves us at a very high level of abstraction. And I would suggest to you that what is most interesting and most significant about media are the differences that set them apart from one another. The differences between different media are differences that make a difference, to use Gregory Bateson's happy phrase. Now, while we're on the subject, I also resist the use of mediums as a plural noun, unless we're at a conference or talking about seances and the occult. So using the plural form mediums, it's not ungrammatical, it's perfectly fine, but it reinforces the divergence and disconnect between medium as a singular noun and media as its plural. And consequently, what I've seen, I mean, hopefully not here, but I've seen it among some students, is that they try to turn media, which thinking of it as a singular noun, turning it into a plural by writing medias. And unless you're speaking Latin, that is just truly abominable. Well, let me begin in earnest by invoking the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, especially important because we don't know how much longer it'll be around these days. But this goes back to 1791, and it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So in effect, the first article of our Bill of Rights protects many different modes of expression and communication. Speech, referring to oral communication, press to written forms, especially as mass-produced by printing. Assembly can be considered a form of communication in and of itself, and it generally also involves speech, people getting together to talk to one another, while petitions may be delivered orally or in writing, and organized religious practice typically involves both orality and literacy. But the point I want to stress is that there is no mention of media in the Bill of Rights or anywhere in our Constitution. Now, contrast this with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1946, and it's Article 19 that states, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So clearly, at some point after 1791 and before 1946, we began to use the term media in its contemporary sense. And I think it's safe to say that this usage is one that originates in the 20th century, and it's connected to the introduction of radio. This new method, when radio was a new method of imparting information from one source to many receivers who are isolated from one another, rather than all assembled in one place, was clearly not a form of public speaking as anyone understood that activity. Nor were the messages disseminated by radio waves a form of the press along the lines of print media. New terms were needed, one of them being mass communication. Maybe you've heard of it. And with it came references to the media of mass communication. That's a mouthful, so that was soon shortened to the mass media. And we love shortening things, so eventually we shortened it to just the media. And in popular discourse, when people make reference to the media, they're often referring only to the news media, almost always only to the mass media. So the concept of mass communication quite naturally led to a tendency to treat mass media as a single phenomenon, characterized by a common set of characteristics such as rapid dissemination of messages, one-way communication, reliance on professional communicators and complex organizations, and so on. It follows that the tradition of mass communication research and scholarship did not emphasize the differences between different types of media, or didn't view them as making all that much of a difference. For a mass communication scholar, the differences between newspapers and radio were not as significant as their commonalities as mass media, while on the other hand, the medium of the telephone was pretty much ignored because it wasn't a mass medium. This led to a strange gap in the scholarly literature in the field of communication because researchers specializing in interpersonal communication would only focus on face-to-face interaction and left the subject of media to the mass communication scholars who wouldn't study something like the telephone. And this is what made the publication of McLuhan's Understanding Media back in 1964 so revolutionary, or one of the many things that did, really. Not only did he ignore the arbitrary division between mass and interpersonal, and doing that substituting just the simple basic term media, and placing media such as telegraph, telephone, photography on an equal footing with radio, newspapers, television, magazines, so forth. But he also argued that newspapers and radio actually had very little in common and were in many ways diametrically opposed to one another, that radio had much more in common with the telephone, for example, both as electronic media and both utilizing the sense of hearing rather than vision. Now, in the field of communication, McLuhan inspired some scholars to break down the arbitrary division between mass and interpersonal, and the popularity later on of the personal computer. This was back in the 80s. I know most of you weren't around then. But that gave rise to a new research area, computer-mediated communication. And today, the phrase mediated communication is often used to refer to mediated forms of interpersonal, group, and organizational communication. Then when we get to the 90s, we get references to new media, digital media, hypermedia, and the like, and that becomes very common. And then in the next decade, we add social media and even emerging media. And all of these ways of talking about media are most definitely a step in the right direction as they leave behind the old narrow association with mass media and that arbitrary division between mass and interpersonal. And they indicate that the older, more limited ways of understanding the term media are no longer valid, and indeed never were. They do tend to suggest, however, that a medium is like a form of transportation or transmission or a pipeline through which messages are sent from one point to another. And really all of our models of communication reflect this. I mean, here's one of the first, maybe you've seen it before. Here's a second one. I'm not going to run through all of them. You'll probably find them all in your basic textbook. But in contrast to the transportation view, media ecology scholars suggested alternatives. McLuhan suggested a transformation view. Tony Schwartz, a colleague of McLuhan's, used the term resonance, and James Carey spoke of a ritual view of communication. But the best counter-metaphor is the one basic to media ecology, that media are environments. Consider the medium of television, if you will. For anyone appearing on television, the screen becomes their environment, and viewers only know them in the context of that environment. At the same time, on the other end, our physical environment is also saturated right now as we sit here with broadcast, satellite, and Wi-Fi signals, and the wires and cables that surround us indoors and out. Now, television sets and receivers change the architecture of our homes and the furniture inside them. And I'll add that it's almost impossible today to find a waiting room in a doctor's or dentist's office or an automotive service center, any such place of business where you have to sit and wait, where they don't have the television playing in an effort to keep their customers entertained. This is also true of airports and the airplanes themselves. Now, when television was first introduced, viewers did pay attention to the medium itself, so even a test pattern was an object of fascination. But it quickly became part of the routine of everyday life, and whatever becomes routinized, becomes a routine, fades into the background, so we no longer notice the medium and only pay attention to the content it carries. In this sense, the medium becomes environmental. And this is where we start to talk about media constituting invisible environments. Not invisible in the sense of transparent, but invisible in the sense that we just ignore them. We don't attend to them. For viewers, television serves as a window onto the world, so our experience and understanding of much of our environment is mediated by television, which means that what we think of as the world, as our environment, is actually television. And the presence of television in our society has affected most of our social institutions, our culture, even our brain structure and function. So we live in an environment that has been completely redefined by television. And that's true regardless of whether we watch television or not, whether you own television or not. It doesn't matter. We're still living in a world that's been fundamentally altered by it. And what I've said about television is true for other media as well. It was true for print media previously. It's true for the computers, internet, and mobile devices today. The point is, in fact, that there are multiple ways in which media can be understood as environments. And I'll add that the basic meaning of the term medium, something situated in the middle that exists between things, that can refer to a linear connection between point A and point B, but it can also refer to a substance that surrounds and pervades. A medium can be the link between two nodes in a network, but it can also be the network in its entirety. To use a metaphor that Postman liked, a medium is also the agar used to grow bacteria in laboratories, the milk that acidophilus bacteria turn into yogurt. And what do we call that batch of bacteria? We call it a culture. It follows that in biology, a medium is an environment in which a culture lives, reproduces, grows, and even evolves. And that understanding extends to media ecology, so that we view cultures as existing inside media, within media as environments, rather than media as nothing more than the product of culture. Now, to understand the broader, and my view, more useful concept of media that we employ in the field of media ecology, I want to quote you a letter from that Benjamin Franklin wrote. You've heard of Benjamin Franklin? Good. He wrote it to a fellow scientist back in 1762. This is the beginning of it. He writes, "Dear Sir, I have perused your paper on sound and would freely mention to you, as you desire it, everything that appeared to me to need correction, but nothing of that kind occurs to me unless it be where you speak of the air as the best medium for conveying sound. Perhaps that is speaking rather too positively, if there be, as I think there are, some other mediums that will convey it further and more readily." So, the term medium here refers to a substance or material through which our senses take in information about our environment. And this wasn't the first use of the term in this way, but I like Benjamin Franklin, so I want to stick with him. And Franklin goes on to suggest that either wood or water may in fact serve as a better medium for conveying sound. And also this usage continues into the 20th century. For example, the Austrian psychologist Fritz Heider emphasized the distinction between a thing and a medium. A thing is any phenomenon out in the world, that exists out in the world, in our physical reality. A medium, according to Heider, is what enables us to perceive that phenomenon. For example, things in our environment being visible to us through the media of air and light. In some ways, this resembles the use of the term channel in communication theory, but channel again has this linear connotation, whereas medium is open to this broader sense of an environment that pervades and surrounds us. And along the same lines, the psychologist James J. Gibson used the concept in a similar fashion to Heider, but with the understanding that we live within our media of visual perception, which allows us to perceive the surfaces of things within our environment, and through that, perceive the environment's affordances. That is, what it can afford us, what it can provide us, offer us, furnish us with, whether as a benefit or a threat. Now, applying this understanding of the term medium to media such as newspapers, radio, television, and telephone, McLuhan emphasized the ways in which they extend our senses and the effects this has on the ways that we use our sensory organs. This would expand the category of media to include devices such as radar and sonar, as well as eyeglasses, hearing aids, telescope, microscope, stethoscope, thermometer, all manner of instruments that extend the range and capacity of our eyes, ears, and other sense organs. Also, the concept of medium as a substance or material has a long association with art. For example, just as Franklin referred to wood as a medium that conveys sound, he might also have noted that wood is a medium from which an artist carves a sculpture, in contrast to the medium of chiseled stone or molded clay. Along similar lines, an artist may paint with the medium of oil paints or with watercolors, or sketch with charcoal or pastels on paper or canvas or on a wall or ceiling. Again, McLuhan recognized the close connection between art and perception, but he was also influenced by Harold Innis, who connected the modern understanding of media with the more traditional concept of artist materials as he focused on the particular importance of writing surfaces in world history. So this expanded understanding of media allows us to incorporate the entire history of writing, stretching across 6 millennia, and older forms of notation that go back even farther, and for that matter, the entire history of art over the past 40 millennia or so. Now, at this point, it may seem as if my understanding of medium is entirely a materialistic one, that is, media as substances, mechanisms, physical environments, but that's not the case, and in this respect, go back to, I'm being patriotic here, go back to, this is a marvelous passage from the Federalist Papers. I was hoping it was by Alexander Hamilton, but it turns out that this one's from James Madison. This is just wonderful. So, just get ready here. So what he writes. All new laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill and passed on the fullest and most mature deliberation, are considered as more or less obscure and equivocal until their meaning be liquidated and ascertained by a series of particular discussions and adjudications. Besides the obscurity arising from the complexity of objects and the imperfection of human faculties, the medium through which the conceptions of men are conveyed to each other adds a fresh embarrassment. The use of words is to express ideas. Perspicuity, therefore, requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but that they should be expressed by words distinctly and exclusively appropriate to them. But no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea, or so correct as not to include many equivocally denoting different ideas. Hence, it must happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, and however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them may be rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy of the terms in which it is delivered. And this unavoidable inaccuracy must be greater or less according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. When the Almighty Himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, His meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. Now, so, medium being words. For additional consultation on this matter, I'd like to turn to the pioneering linguistic anthropologist Edward Sapir and read a passage from his 1921 book, the title, Language. He writes, "Languages are more to us than systems of thought transference. They are invisible garments that drape themselves about our spirit and give a predetermined form to all its symbolic expression. When the expression is of unusual significance, we call it literature. Art is so personal an expression that we do not like to feel that it is bound to predetermined form of any sort. The possibilities of individual expression are infinite. Language, in particular, is the most fluid of mediums. Yet some limitation there must be to this freedom, some resistance of the medium. In great art, there is the illusion of absolute freedom. The formal restraints imposed by the material, paint, black and white, marble, piano tones, or whatever it may be, they are not perceived. It is as though there were a limitless margin of elbow room between the artist's fullest utilization of form and the most that the material is innately capable of. The artist has intuitively surrendered to the inescapable tyranny of the material, made its brute nature fuse easily with his conception. The material disappears precisely because there is nothing in the artist's conception to indicate that any other material exists. For the time being, he, and we with him, move in the artistic medium as a fish moves in the water, oblivious to the existence of an alien atmosphere. No sooner, however, does the artist transgress the law of his medium than we realize with a start that there is a medium to obey. Language is the medium of literature as marble or bronze or clay are the materials of the sculptor. Since every language has its distinctive peculiarities, the innate formal limitations and possibilities of one literature are never quite the same as those of another. So, language. So Sapir ties together the idea of the artist medium and the idea of a medium as an all-encompassing substance and environment with the idea of medium as invisible and as a material that is not in fact material, but rather a code or a symbol. This extends to the physical form of language as speech, but more importantly, to the general concept of language and symbolic communication, as well as to specific languages such as French, German, Mandarin, and Hebrew. McLuhan and other media ecology scholars built upon the idea that languages are media, and media are languages writ large. In many ways, language is our primary medium of communication, but we can also include all other codes and symbol systems as media, including art forms and even modes of perception. Beyond symbolic form, the concept of form in general is the equivalent of medium. The distinction between form and content being one aspect of the distinction between medium and content. And form is also synonymous with pattern and relates to structure, grammar, and rules. All of these are interconnected with the idea of medium and are aspects of medium. We can also, at the same time, look at biology and include that within the category of media. The differences between the structure and functioning of the eye and the ear are differences that make a difference, as are the differences between the structure and functioning of the human eye and the eyes of a dog or a frog or a bumblebee. We can also include the brain and, for that matter, the body in its entirety as media, characterized by specific structures that impose particular constraints and provide certain affordances. Understanding the body as medium is consistent with the psychoanalytic perspective of Sigmund Freud and with some varieties of feminist theory, including that of Camille Paglia. Human media, if we talk about human media now, that would also include, again, in a non-physical sense, human organization. And that, an example of that would be strict linear hierarchies, which we sometimes call going through channels. It would also include nonlinear networks, bureaucracies, any kind of organization. And then further, following Edward T. Hall, we could also regard space and place as media that structure and our behavior, interaction, and thought processes, as, for example, the differences between a classroom and a nightclub, or between going to church and going to the beach, or between sitting in a theater and watching television in the privacy of our own home. And Postman included all manner of face-to-face situations and contexts as objects of study for media ecology. Now, paralleling McLuhan's contrast between content and medium, Paul Watzlawick and his colleagues, not too far from here, built on Gregory Bateson's work and posited two levels of communication, content and relationship. Relationship and content parallels form and content, both aspects of medium and content. In other words, relationships are a kind of medium. A relationship is a kind of medium. Relationships are environmental. We speak of being in a relationship, after all, and we stop paying attention to them after a while. They become invisible as we take them for granted. Relationships structure and constrain our communication. We speak differently depending on our relationship. We speak differently to our parents as opposed to lovers, as opposed to teachers, as opposed to students, colleagues, and so on. And we can regard, say, watching television and going to the movies as different kinds of relationships, as are sending an email, talking on the phone, or sending a text. Bateson, Watzlawick, and the rest refer to communication on the relationship level as meta-communication. So media then are a form of meta-communication, or rather, meta-communication is communication on the medium, on the level of medium. And the idea of media and content as constituting different levels connects us to Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell's theory of logical types, different levels, and also to systems theory. A medium can be regarded as a system with its content and its users situated inside this system as the equivalent of the parts that together form the whole. What makes a system greater than the sum of its parts is the structure they form, or their interaction, or their relationship. In this sense, the concept of medium brings together structure, interaction, relationship, the meta level, grammar, rules, context, situation, and of course, environment. In systems theory, the system is an environment for its contents, but also can itself be situated inside a larger environment that itself could be a larger system. The idea of systems nested within other systems brings to mind McLuhan's observation that the content of a medium is another medium, by which he means that any given medium can serve as content of another medium. J. David Bolter and Richard Gruson dubbed this phenomenon remediation. In this regard, the spoken word becomes the content of the written text, the writing becomes the content of print, print becomes the content of electronic text, and so on. When a physical medium becomes the content of another medium, it is transformed into style or form, that is, rather than substance. Now, understanding medium then requires us to go beyond the materialities of communication and beyond communication itself. In perhaps his most radical move, McLuhan used the terms media and technology more or less synonymously and drew upon the long-standing notion that technologies are extensions of human capabilities. And that was an idea that he didn't originate, but was previously discussed by Edward T. Hall, by C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards, and back in the 19th century by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Media as extensions most readily brings to mind tools and their further elaboration as machines and gadgets. To this, Lewis Mumford brings a useful corrective in arguing that we should not overlook the container as a form of technology, from pots and bowls to wells and cisterns to architecture, settlements, and cities. This helps to clarify the connection between extension and environment, and in that regard I would note Max Frisch's clever quote that technology is the art of never having to experience the world. As an extension, a technology mediates between ourselves and our world, extending us in one sense, but also coming between us and the world in another sense. And for this reason, McLuhan noted that every extension is also an amputation. The medium that extends us also shields us from the world. And whatever comes between us and our environment, in effect, becomes our environment. In this way, McLuhan's equation of media and technology provide a new and very significant way of understanding technology, one that acknowledges the central role of communication in the history of technology, indeed in the history of the world. While we tend to think of technology in material terms, that concept also includes technique, what we sometimes refer to as know-how. For example, the assembly line is a technique that can be applied to conveyor belts or fast food counters. The alphabet is a technique that can be used in conjunction with pen and paper, movable type, electrons and photons, or for that matter, with a stick in the sand in the beach, or with a finger moving through the air. A medium, then, can refer to any means or method, and McLuhan's famous aphorism is actually derived from a quote by Ashley Montagu, who wrote, "In teaching, it is the method and not the content that is the method, that is the message," right? So the means, the method, also the questions we ask. A question is a medium then, the answer is its content. And of all the questions that we can ask, the one that's of particular significance is the question of how. One of the basic meanings of the medium is the message is that the way that we do things has much to do with what we end up doing. And the way that we do things has much to do with what we end up with when we do the things that we do. And the way that we do things has much to do with what we become by doing the things that we do. Now, McLuhan also made other references. He talked about gaps and intervals, resonances and the total field, all terms that are associated with an understanding of medium. In its most basic meaning, medium refers to a quality of in-betweenness, which from a limited point of view refers to what goes between, but in its fullest sense refers to what surrounds and pervades, what is environmental. The relationship between an environment and its contents, or a medium and its content, is an asymmetrical one, as is the relationship in perception between a figure and the ground that surrounds us. And I think we can think of this also as a kind of approach, a kind of grammar or dialectic, dialectical grammar, grammatical dialectic, I don't know what to call it. But here's a quote from McLuhan in a TV interview in 1970 that I find very significant. He said, "Affluence creates poverty as a form of complementarity, just as without the white man, there are no colored people. It's a figure-ground relationship. And there are many forms of it. Learning creates ignorance." And he goes on to explain, literally, during the Depression, nobody talked about poverty. They talked about hardship, but there was no affluence. And so affluence is the ground that creates the figure of poverty, and it makes it noticeable. In other words, affluence is the medium, and poverty is its message. By the same token, learning is the medium, and ignorance is its message. And the concept of the white race, as McLuhan put it, is a medium whose message is the other of the non-white races. Let me give you some other examples. I think this is really interesting to start thinking about. And there's the classic polar opposition between body and mind. That can be better understood as the body as the medium and the mind as its content. The mind is not the body, but it emerges out of the body, is contained within the body, is dependent upon the body, and may also affect and alter the body. Looking at the body as medium it's also interesting to consider how its content, the content of the body, is another medium. So you remember McLuhan said, content of a medium is another medium. What's the content of the body? it's the medium of the ocean. We carry it in our circulatory system, which originally was the medium that surrounds us, once served as the body's actual environment. Another example, rather than a binary opposition between life and death, it's clear that life is the medium that makes death possible. So in that sense, death is life's ultimate message. Ian McGilchrist has this view of the brain and the relationship between the right and left hemispheres that he refers to as the master and his emissary, which suggests that the right brain is the medium and the left brain is its message or content. A similar parallel in psychoanalysis, particularly consistent with Carl Jung's view of consciousness, is that the unconscious mind is the medium and the conscious mind emerges out of the unconscious. Take another example, Augustine's commentary on the experience of time, right? The present is the medium whose contents are the past and the future. You all know this, right? You must have this. To this I would add that time is the medium out of which space emerges. Another example, that chaos and order are not dualistic, opposing forces, but rather in accordance with contemporary systems theory, chaos is the fundamental medium of the universe, and order is the content or message that emerges out of chaos. It certainly suggests that medium and media serve as a convenient way to refer to dynamic processes. A medium is a process rather than a thing or a static phenomenon. And there's a danger of reification we run into when we talk about media if we don't look at it this way. So we get, and if you're in media ecology, I mean, McLuhan would get this, these stupid, pointless questions like, is television viewed on different devices the same medium or a different one? Is a laptop the same medium as a desktop computer or a different medium? Is a paperback edition of a book the same medium or is a hardcover or not? I mean, it's stupid. It's not either or. What we're concerned with is not a medium or media as things, but with a process of mediation, or better yet, a process of mediating. So whatever makes a difference is significant. Now, I've endeavored to provide some idea of my understanding of the key term of medium as it's used within the field of media ecology, of how broadly the term can be employed and therefore defined, in turn defining the subject matter of the field and the approach. And the following list is unavoidably incomplete, but can serve as one kind of summary. So I'll just read it to you, but it would include things like environment, communication technology, means, mode of communication, channel, link, substance, sensation, material, surface, language, grammar, rules, translation, metaphor, code, symbol, sign, form, pattern, senses, nervous system, body, place, situation, context, organization, network, relationship, meta level, system, structure, interaction, boundary, technology, technique, extension, amputation, container, interface, method, questions, how, invention, innovation, ground or background, gaps and intervals, mediation, process of mediating, middle ground, in-betweenness, environment. And I began and ended the list with environment to underline its importance for the study of media as environments, but also to indicate that that list I just went through is not simply a linear progression of ideas. It's better conceptualized as circular in form, or maybe following the internet, a distributed network in which each item is linked to every other item to form a conceptual web. Something that I can't even, I tried to do it on paper once and it just turned into spaghetti. It was impossible. So just stay with that. Why is such a broad understanding of medium necessary, or rather, what's the purpose of bringing all of these elements together? Certainly, it does clarify how media ecology is not simply a field concerned with television and the internet, but rather an approach to understanding the human condition in its entirety. To quote Douglas Adams, to life, the universe, and everything. It's medium writ large. It provides the common ground for understanding media in all its aspects, a common basis for studying all of these disparate phenomena, if you like, a unified field approach. As an approach, media ecology is more than merely a social or cultural theory. Rather, it's a way of understanding any given subject matter. And that is why, as far as I'm concerned, the concept of medium writ large is at the very least not abominable. Thank you.
We have time for some questions, if there are any.
We got one here.
Can it ever be one-to-one? And what I'm asking is the term social media, which using the word media makes it sound like, and everybody thinks of it as the viral version, but most social media is literally one-to-one.
One-to-one.
One person to one person.
Sure. I mean, your question is, can a medium connect one person to one? I mean, that's the telephone, right? It's writing a letter. It's having a conversation. It's whatever. I mean, we can have an environment. We can have a room with just two people in it, right? So it certainly can be. That's and what we can look at, you know, when we're looking at it in this way, is what is, in a sense, the bias. And that's like the next chapter in the book. But I mean, what is the underlying bias or tendency of the medium? You know, so we find that, for example, in wireless media, it's hard to keep that between two people. Whereas wired media, it's harder to distribute that to many people. So there's something inherent in the technology or in the structure, the physical structure of the medium, that will push it in one direction or another, which doesn't mean you can't do it in the other directions. It just means that it has a tendency to work better one way or another.
Forms of mass media.
Yes, Ed, you have a question?
I do, Professor. Forms of mass mediation in the digital age allow for not just one-to-one communication. I can send you a photo or a message on Facebook, but then there's the tendency for there to be this mass electronic voyeurism where 200 of my best friends forever are seeing the same message.
Right.
So the distinctions are getting blurred between individual messages and mass message.
Yeah, I quite true, and I think that further shows that those categories are not the most useful, and that really goes back to, I mean, what we're talking about, because in a way the distinction between mass and interpersonal that seems so odd to some of us, you know, back in the day. But that can be traced all the way back to the distinction in ancient Greece between the sophists and the philosophers. So, you know, it's the distinction between public speaking, rhetoric and oratory, and dialogue that, you know, that Socrates is so closely identified with. You know, the idea that dialogue is superior to public speaking. But, you know, it's like, why create this divide? It's a false division. I mean, in part because, you know, for one example, that idea of assembly, people get together, different people can alternate in public speaking, while people in the audience are talking to one another. I mean, there's more going on than all of that. So I mean, I quite agree. And the internet brings all kinds of new, strange possibilities. But we also saw it earlier on, talk radio, right? And you have the telephone call conversation as a medium that then becomes the content of the radio mass medium. So those interactions were always there. and they were things that didn't fit into the nice, neat, divided categories, so they didn't know what to do with them. But if we just look at this is what radio's about, or this is what electronic media are about as a category, we have a better way of getting a handle on these things. Quite agree.
I have one follow-up to that, too.
I don't know.
Well, bear with me. At one point, we would get messages from the White House through the press secretary to the press pool that would then get distributed through newspapers and radio and television.
Mm-hmm.
It was a broadcast model, one to many. Messages now are sent from the Trump Winter White House in Florida through the medium of tweets, and it's still a one-to-many model of distribution, but all of the intermediaries have been cut out. And
Right.
so what we end up with now is this new age of fake news, where nothing is verifiable seemingly or have any epistemic support to the truth claims. So how has our understanding of media and the media as the fourth estate been changed in this modern era of fake news in the Trump administration?
Well, I think Harold Innis's concept of monopoly of knowledge fits in very well here. The professional journalism held a monopoly of knowledge for about a century. I mean, because there wasn't, I mean, it really developed in the second half of the 19th century. Because, you know, Benjamin Franklin put out a newspaper. He wasn't a professional journalist. There weren't any in the early 1800s. But they developed a kind of monopoly, and that has been broken apart by new media, by social media. That is, and the way I see it, I mean, you know, Neil Postman liked to emphasize the negative aspects of these things. I mean, my last scholarly book, Amazing Ourselves to Death, I followed up on Postman's arguments, and so, I mean, also focused on the negative, on these kind of negative effects. But the bottom line is that there's costs and benefits. There's something good about breaking the monopoly. The situation you described, all right, it was not simply one of just plain old mass communication, but in fact, you're talking about, we were talking about this earlier, about elite integration. So you have the White House press secretary as a go-between. We're going through channels now. The president communicates something to the press secretary, and often not everything. So the press secretary is often in this odd, difficult position. The press secretary then communicates with the White House press corps, and there is this sort of problem of you don't want to be left out of that group if you're part of that group, which, you know, you have a certain stake then that keeps you from being totally objective or totally critical, and that was subject to criticism some years ago. And then they communicate to the reading public or to the broadcast audience. So we really have more than just a kind of the sort of simplistic mass communication setup going on. And that's not to count in things like that Daniel Boorstin spoke about, the pseudo-events. I mean, the press conference itself is a pseudo-event, but then we have background briefings, which are not attributed to anyone. They're just provided to the journalists. They print it up as factual accounts, but with no attribution. No one's quoted. We have, of course, leaks, which have become such a big subject now, but in Understanding Media back in 1964, McLuhan had a chapter on the press, and it was subtitled "Government by Newsleak." So I mean, and you know, and that is again something that is said to a reporter, but without any attribution. So it's printed as, and this reporter was told, or a high-ranking official in the administration said this, and we're left to wonder, is it true or not? Is it accurate? Some of these were also called trial balloons, because that, you want to put out a policy like let's cut Medicare, you want to see how people react, and then people freak out, and you say, well, I never said that, right? I mean, it was just put out as a kind of test case. So there's so much interaction going on there. The question then is the cost and benefit of breaking down that organization in favor of something new. And the problem is it's very hard to determine what the cost is going to be. We usually hear a lot about the benefits, like so you can reach an audience, directly. It's very hard to know what the cost is going to be, because the cost always comes later. It's buy now, pay later. And we're in the position of buying things without knowing what we're paying, how much we're going to pay for them. That from a postman point of view is the problem. But I had a, yeah. No.
So do you see the categories of like media, and when you were relating like the different kinds of form and content, do you see those as like stable categories that will remain relatively okay for a while, or do you think like media ecology is gonna? I mean, I don't know much about media ecology as like as a field, so I'm not sure if you guys are already doing this, but do you think it's kind of something where you're gonna have to be constantly revising and constantly going over previous work to like apply it?
Well, first of all, there's always new media being introduced, so we never can kind of rest in that regard. But I think once you start to look at it as relationships, or this sort of like asymmetrical dialectic, or if you like, that then they're not stable categories in the sense that they are relative, and something that is a medium can become the content of something else. And in some ways, something that seems to be content can, in another situation, or can have be a medium to something else. So I think understanding it as, I think the understanding is more of a dynamic one. Now, I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, because you're.
It was just kind of like, so
Yeah.
you see it kind of as constantly shifting, but still maintaining kind of like a relative.
Yeah. Well, I like to think. I mean, these are tools. So. The question is, what are we interested in? What are we trying to find out? And then how can we apply this to the subject matter at hand? And that has to be adjusted, just as we adjust our equipment when we're doing things. So, yeah.
Well, the exciting thing is that the media, the medium, is always there, but so are people. People never change over the centuries. So just like Moses got these two big pieces of rock with the Ten Commandments on them, and then in the 1700s and 1800s and early 1900s, people would have newspapers. Now they have blogs.
Right.
And it's the same thing.
Well, I think, I mean, there's some differences of opinion, depending on who in the field of media ecology you turn to. So someone like Lewis Mumford would agree with the idea that people fundamentally don't change. But many others, including McLuhan and Ong and I think Postman, take a different view, that the people do change in very, very significant and fundamental ways. And of course, the story of Moses is, and we don't know how to take that, especially because there's no evidence of any kind of writing on stone among the ancient Semites of that region. Just the fact that it was, whatever happened, whatever that story of the Exodus refers to as a real event in history, and I assume there was something that happened. it coincides fairly well with the introduction of the alphabet, of the Semitic alphabet. And so you go back further and it's not there. And that changes the way people acted and behaved. And that's why, I mean, going back to Harold Innis was the first I know of who suggested that the alphabet was in a sense, the cause, if you like, or the innovation that made possible monotheism. And that's a significant change, but I mean, and the kind of more general, larger change is a change in ways of thinking, so that people were able to think in more abstract ways. So that instead of saying there are many gods, each with their own respective areas, their localities and so forth, to say there's only one God, and plus you can't see God or touch or do anything. It's just, and God is everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go. I mean, that's very abstract. It's a very strange idea when you think about it. This highly transcendental notion, which is why the whole history of everything, the whole history of religion after that point is about almost like trying to claw back that idea until we finally get to atheism, which is really just the next step beyond. I mean, if God is if God is everything, then the next logical step is God is nothing. But anyway, I mean, I think that those are fundamental changes in human nature. And if we look at ourselves as products of our environment, even to the extent that environmental conditions can have an effect on our genetic material, then we do change. But patterns, I think, maybe where we can find agreement is that there are patterns, and this is part of the media ecological method, is to understand that there are patterns in history, and the patterns, they don't necessarily repeat exactly, but when we can pay attention to the patterns recurring, like monopolies of knowledge forming and then being broken by the introduction of a new medium, we can see, perhaps get a sense of where we're going. Hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls.
I have one follow-up concluding question, but are there any other questions? Anyone else? In 1993, Neil Postman was here at St. Mary's, and in his talk, he was addressing the question of technopoly and the monopoly of tyranny of technology. And in 1993, how he was commenting on how we shifted from the patterns of religion in the age of, and then it turned into, in the age of modernism, the patterns of technology. And we worship at the feet of technology more than the feet of God. So the very first question that was asked of Neil was, now that you've been at St. Mary's for a few days, what patterns do you see here at St. Mary's that would give comfort and solace to anyone confused by this newly emergent technical world? And his response was, I remember he said, as a Jew, I love walking around the campus and seeing all of your Christian iconography, because whether you believe in it or not, it gives you a foundation to start from. Mm-hmm. And at least something to, if you don't believe in it, at least you know what you're not believing in. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the technical age, we don't even know what we don't know. So now that you've been here for a few days, what can you give us by way of consolation and solace in this very confusing age that we live in now?
Can I just do what Neil did? Well, I think that was a charming answer. I mean, I remember being in seminar with Neil in the doctoral program, where he commented that we're really all atheists today. That, which is to say, functionally, we function as atheists. We don't do anything that really suggests that we believe in something else. If you're sick, you go to a doctor. We don't think of, as people once did, that God actually makes the sun rise and sunset, from day to day. So I think that religion has something important to offer, and I think it's good to be cognizant of it. And one of the suggestions for possibilities is to study all the religions, or study many religions, and as a way of understanding, and wisdom literature. I'm not right now. I'm feeling. When was Neil here? In
1993.
So Clinton was president. He was probably feeling a lot better than I'm feeling right now. And I really don't know, though. I don't know at this point what kind of solace there is. What I suspect is that we're not doing so well, and perhaps it may be that the best we can hope for is the kind of the old monastery idea of isolated pockets where the torch of learning and rational thinking is kept alive. Maybe we can do better, but right now, it's sort of like the problem, and we brought it up in a conversation. Seeing what happened with Trump, if you're a progressive, if you have a progressive mindset, then what's the proper course of action? Is it in the next election to run Al Franken because he was a TV star? He's a senator now. He actually isn't a bad choice because he's actually a bright guy. But to choose someone based on their ability, or now they're talking about Oprah. Do you do that? That is, and that's the question of medium versus content in this case. Do you go for trying to get a better content by running a candidate that works with the medium, the prevailing medium, even though that prevailing medium is what's killing us, is what's destroying our culture? Or do you oppose that medium? Now, this was Postman's suggestion about education, that schools should try to go against the grain of electronic culture and emphasize more traditional values, in the sense of literacy, reading, writing, rational thought, and all of that. Do you go against it, but with the probability then that you're not going to be too successful, that you're fighting a losing battle? And I don't know what the answer is. After this election, I'm saying, heck yeah, get some celebrity up there, get a star, if that's what we have to do. But because it's the question of lesser of two evils at this point. But it seems that if you want things to work properly, you have to go with the biases of the medium. The biases of the medium right now, of electronic culture, are contrary to most of the biases of print culture. And most of what we consider to be fundamental to, what made America great. If you really want to make America great again, get rid of all the electronics in a way. What is it? Democracy was based on the ability to read and write and be informed about events so that you could vote. You could vote in an educated way. Education, schooling, reading and writing and arithmetic was considered the fundamental equalizer in our society, guaranteeing equality of opportunity to all people. Even religion was sort of fundamental, in the sense of providing an ethical basis and a kind of basis in law. But that's really evaporated in a way. We have one camp of fundamentalists, and then a lot of people who a lot of people have all these different points of view, without any sort of common sense that there is such a thing as being unethical, or that our law, our system of law and justice has a basis in sort of unalienable human rights and all of that. I mean, that has really faded out. And of course, journalism. As much as broadcast journalism has been attacked, I mean, all this stuff against CNN, but I mean, it was simply the ability to read things in depth that was the key. So I don't know how we get out of that. It seems that everything that our way of life, and when you talk about the West, I mean, McLuhan said Western culture, I mean, it was the alphabet. This alphabetic culture. I mean, all of that has ended. So where we go now, I don't know. We won't be around that much longer to see where it winds up. I mean, it's kind of scary. But you have to be optimistic. You have to hope for the best. Thanks.